A decade and a half ago, Schiit Audio was building the Asgard headphone amplifier in a garage by hand, and now it's built in a factory in Texas, one of two, so far have we come. But Schiit Audio almost considered, well, shit canning the Asgard because it just wasn't selling. Probably not a surprise given that one of their most popular headphone amps is the $200 Midgard at, about half the price. So Jason decided to have one more shot at it and make an absolutely fire-breathing Class A headphone amplifier in the vein of the very original. And what is more, you can buy it with an inbuilt mesh card DAC optionally, or you can actually use it with one of their DACs or an external DAC. So I decided to find out if I was starting again in the hobby, would the Asgard X have suited me, because it's certainly way more sophisticated than what you could get a decade and a half ago, or for me, closer to 2 decades ago. Now, the thing I like about the Asgard is its old school simplicity, with a lot of amps and DACs having sophisticated screens and controls and buttons or what have you. With the Asgard X, you just have a regular volume pot. You have regular switches, which you can switch in either the DAC card or an RCA input or the gain, or whether or not it actually has the preamp output activated. As for the inputs, you just basically plug it in. You plug in either one or both of the inputs depending what you want to do. The mesh card's USB-C or the RCA analog inputs. The only real problem is that you kind of have to still do the reach around to get the power on, but that's one of those things that just tends to annoy customers a little bit. But once it's on your desk, all you do is you plug in headphones into one of the two sockets and listen. Now, the sophisticated component is they've taken the halo output of the Midgard and put it inside the Asgard X. And I'm going to explain what that means because it has a little bit of sophisticated circuitry in there to improve distortion. But you can use the regular 6.3mm output if you don't want to engage that. Now, if you're already familiar with Schiit Audio products, you may be aware of their Gallahorn speaker amp, which is the same size as the Asgard X. And they have more or less put a Gallahorn heatsink in this, and you can probably see it sitting above the volume control, which incidentally doesn't actually get hot, though it might look like it would, because it does run hot as Class A. More or less, I gather what Jason did with the design is he took the older school continuity design from the Asgard 3, and he normally with Class A, Class AB type headphone amplifiers where you have half the signal running through different transistors, he inverted that so that the whole signal was running through all the transistors, and after some experimentation and some magic smoke due to the fiery nature of the amplifier, he tamed it into the Asgard X. And given how popular something like the Mjolnir is, I mean, I just literally bought one, it's not a surprise that people would be interested in a old school, hot running Class A amplifier that drives headphones very well. As usual, I tested the amp with a variety of headphones. Speaking of the headphones, if you are looking for a reliable dealer to buy headphones from in the United States, do check out Bloom Audio, who is also the sponsor of this channel. But the amp itself, with 3 watts of power output, certainly has enough for driving pretty much anything. But what is more, it's not so much raw power or raw numbers, but how well did it keep up with complex music and harder to drive headphones. And suffice to say, at this kind of level of design, that is not an issue whatsoever. It could well and truly keep up without sounding pressured or shouty in louder passages at louder volumes. So it was more the subtle differences between it and other amplifiers that became the focus of my listening. For example, I listened to from Celeste, This Is Who I Am, from the Day of the Jackal soundtrack, actually from her album Woman of Faces. Celeste sings extremely passionately in that track. And on another device which I have in for review, which is a typical Texas Instruments headphone amplifier chip with ESS DAC, it sounds a little bit aggressive and a little bit too shouty and a little bit too unreal for my preferences. But I didn't have that kind of problem with the Asgard X, even with the mesh card. The presentation of it is what people might call very slightly warm, but I tend to call Class A headphone amplifiers not warm as such, but more naturally capable. They don't have to feel like they're pushing the music at you to sound powerful, and they're also very revealing of the source that they are connected to. Previous Asgard 3 not being a Class A amp did approach this to a degree, and certainly wasn't shouty with the volume turned up, but very capable using Schiit Audio's Class AB continuity system, and for most people, most of the time running in Class A anyway. Comparing it with the new Asgard X, I felt that the Asgard X at the same volume level with the same headphones and the same source, the Mimir, is a bit more open sounding with a slightly better sense of depth of soundstage. However, you can't use the old multi-bit DAC cards in the new Asgard X. But the mesh card too, I can say I appreciate having done my Vestry review and listened more carefully with the Vestry on its own before doing this review, because it gave me an appreciation for the sophistication of what's in the mesh card. Now, the mesh card uses an ES9018 DAC, which some people would say, hey, that's a bit long in the tooth, but because it uses Schiit Audio's proprietary digital filters, it does have that more, what another manufacturer called a more youthful presentation of vocals. It doesn't have that slightly hard and etched sound that ESS DACs do, but sounds a little bit more natural. Although I found that compared to the Mimir, which sounds a little bit more open and a little bit more natural and a bit more detailed, it can sound ever so slightly what I would call wooden in comparison to the Mimir. It still sounded pretty good as things go, and I didn't ever have those issues I often have with regular DACs, where I sometimes go, hey, that piano doesn't sound right, or those cymbals sound a little bit unnatural. That kind of issue didn't come up, which is what I really appreciate about the sophistication of Schiit Audio's mesh design. So, listening fresh in the morning when the previous day's listening was more of a distant memory, I really found I could enjoy the Asgard X on its own with the mesh card, with whatever music I listened to. Now, was it the be-all and end-all? Well, you can get more detail and resolution out of a Schiit Audio product. What happens if I jump up to, say, the Jotunheim? The Jotunheim sounded a little bit more detailed, a little bit more open, a little bit deeper in sound. It was a little bit better, just like the Mimir was a little bit better in those respects versus the mesh card. So then, of course, jumping from the Asgard X with mesh card up to the Jotunheim and Mimir, given that the difference in price is only about $300, that made for a significant jump up in sound quality. Going back to the Asgard X, maybe versus the better gear, there will be a little bit more haze to the sound, a little bit less clarity, a little bit more thickness. So I thought what would be interesting to compare was a similar Class A DAC or DAC amp, that is Aone's N7. Now the N7 is, well, you could call it a cut down version of the S17, where they've taken out the power supply and instead use an external switching power supply, for better or for worse. It is fairly similar price to the Asgard X, and you can also buy a DAC inclusive version of it, although I don't have that on hand. Comparing both using the Mimir as the source, I found that the N7 was a little bit more precise sounding, although maybe that made it a little bit narrower sounding in how it presents its soundstage, versus the Asgard X, which was a little bit more easygoing and relaxed in its presentation. Between either of them, both are equally great amplifiers, and I wouldn't choose necessarily between one or the other, as they have different pros and cons. The N7 is maybe a little bit smaller in size, and for some people, having the external wall wart may be more convenient, whereas the Asgard X has the option of that mesh DAC card, although you could of course buy something like the Vestry and use it as a source for the N7, and that would work perfectly well. But there are two more aspects that are worth considering. The first is the halo output, and the second is performance with in-ear monitors. Starting with in-ear monitors, Campfire Audio's Andromeda 10s, like a lot of Campfire IEMs, are very sensitive to any kind of noise. Plugging them into either of the halo or 6.3mm outputs, there was a very slight power supply hum, be 50 or 60 Hertz, and that was the only detriment to that. But in low gain, I found that I could hit the 9 o'clock position and have just about the right amount of listening volume for most of the music I listened to. So other than that slight hum, which was independent of what I plugged it into, the Asgard performed pretty well. But that leaves the halo output. That's an interesting one, and it probably requires a bit of background to understand, but more or less amplifiers take a signal and power and merge them into a larger signal, and in doing so induce a little bit of distortion, so manufacturers add some negative feedback from the input to the output to cancel that out. An interesting trick would be to add the headphones into that feedback loop, and that's what the Halo system does for potentially, although this is not confirmed, even lower distortion. Now, compared to the 6.3mm output, I found that the Halo output made things sound a little bit more flatter, even, and honestly a little bit more boring. I think that the Asgard X lost some of that Class A magic using the halo output. And that was whether I used, say, Focal's Utopias, which are dynamic driver, or planar driver headphones such as Hi-Fi Man's Aria Organics. If you tried the halo output on something like the Asgard X, do let me know in the comments how it went for you, if you found it worked with a particular headphones or in-ear monitors. But for me, I stuck with the 6.3s. It sounded a little bit more, well, a little bit more exciting, a little bit more musical. Yeah, terrible audiophile term comes out again. One other thing I wanted to try is the Forkbeard remote control for the mesh DAC card, with balance, non-oversampling, phase inversion, and importantly, a 3-band EQ, which you can adjust 6 decibels up or down, and even the width of the adjustment. I thought it would be interesting to try something like the Aria Organics or other headphones, which for some of the music I listen to maybe are, for example, a touch weak in the bass. So in EQing up, say, at 20 Hertz, I got a little bit of a nice lift for some of the more exciting music I listen to, such as Weak by Vintage Culture. But the problem I ran into is when I tried to raise the bass by 6 decibels at, say, 40 Hertz, I could clearly hear digital clipping. At up to about 5 decibels boost, it was okay, but at 6, it was clipping. It turned out that if you're going to turn one of the EQ bands up, you should also lower the digital volumes to ensure that it doesn't digitally clip. However, for something like a slight lift in the bass, or more importantly, being able to notch out any kind of bright frequency which clashes with your own ears, can be very handy in something like a headphone amplifier. Or if you have, say, some headphones which are a little bit too V-shaped for preference, or a little bit too hot in the mid-range, then you can adjust things accordingly to balance everything up. So does it meet my criteria for an all-in-one if I was starting again in the hobby? Absolutely yes. I reckon as an all-in-one, especially with a mesh card, or just as a headphone amplifier, especially if you have a more basic DAC, or maybe even a slightly more sophisticated one, and you just want something with a straightforward single-ended output, then the Asgard X definitely meets those criteria, and you don't have to worry whether it's going to drive headphones well. But if you're considering something like an Asgard X versus something more sophisticated, I would go the full Jotunheim, Mimir, and maybe even Lokius as well, for the full experience of what you can do before the law of diminishing returns really heavily starts to kick in. Now, if you have an Asgard X, I'd definitely like to hear from you, and I'm sure everyone looking at this review deciding whether to buy one would like to hear from real owners as well. So do leave a comment with your experiences, it'll be most welcome. Also, thank you to all my patrons and caffeinators for their continued support. It has made this channel possible, as well as the sponsorship from Bloom Audio and Final. As always, thanks once again for watching.